This is the Point and Click podcast with your host, Mark Yafchak.
And welcome to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to dive into the ever-evolving world of e-publishing. I'm happy to have Nancy Roberts joining me as we talk with author Kelly Conway, who's making waves with her impressive collection of e-books. Now, did you know as of 2024, over 50% of the books sold in the United States were e-books? That's right, more than half of all readers are now embracing the digital formats. And with the global ebook market expected to reach $25 billion by 2025, it's clear that e-publishing is fundamentally changing the literary landscape. Before we dive into our conversation with Kelly, don't forget you can subscribe to the Point and Click podcast so that you'll never miss an upcoming episode. So I'm thrilled to have as our next guest the incredibly talented author Kelly Conway, who has written several e-books. She's going to talk to us about how the e-book process worked for her and give our listeners an idea about what that entails. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I read your bio, and I did get a chance to read a few sample pages from your new book, Peridot.
Peridot.
Yeah.
Very interesting. What was your primary motivation and inspiration for writing this ebook, and why did you use publishing as your route?
Well, this is actually my 8th book.
Okay.
Peridot is my first foray into something that's sort of out of my element. I've been a patient blogger for 13, 14 years, where I have written a lot about myself and what it's like living with chronic illness. So my first series that I published that was nonfiction, or that was fiction rather, was a series about people living with illnesses that I also live with. So I wanted to depict people who were living with chronic illness, yet had very fulfilling lives, had careers, had relationships, and had lives. So that was my first go into this. But back in 2010, I volunteered in Africa. And I remember saying to my friends, you know, I need to take books because I'm not going to have TV. I don't know how I'm going to spend my time. What book should I take? And my friend decided that, you know, you need a Kindle. And this was back in, this is, you know, 13, 14 years ago. Kindles were very new then.
Uh-huh.
So she got me a Kindle, and that opened my world to all these self-published authors. And I had read all these amazing stories, and I always had stories in my head. So Peridot, I wanted to do a series about sisters. And so they're the Sterling sisters. There's Peridot. Next up will be Sapphire, then Ruby. And then the last one is Amethyst. And it's going to be, you know, a family-centered series with romance and a little mystery and a little crime. So it's going to be mixed in together. So Peridot is really my first, I felt out of my element with writing because it's really me telling a story that didn't have elements of me in it. So I don't know if that's a little
So more original material. Nancy, you had a question about the writing process?
Well, I guess, I was going to, you got the inspiration based on your life and then your adventures in writing itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The process is, I guess you wouldn't have, do you have a comparison with e-publish versus regular publish? That is to say, the old version where you queried and...
Right. So I have been a part of several books based on people living with chronic illness. I've been featured in a few books. So in those instances, I was given sort of, this is what we want to focus on. Please tell your story, and have it be this many characters and this length. So in doing something like that, I have more of a format. And in writing about myself and in writing about chronic illness, I can write a blog in 2 seconds. If I'm researching something, then I do take the time. Like the book that I just wrote, a lot of it was about baseball. I know a lot about baseball, but I wanted to make sure that things I was including in the book were accurate, making sure I was using the right terminology. And next up, I'm doing a book about a wedding planner, and I know nothing about that. So I'm on a lot of Reddit boards. I'm doing a lot of research and what you need to do to be a wedding planner. So I do research on what I feel like the characters' occupations. I make sure that I know enough about that, so I'm not writing and I'm not making it up. The medical stuff that I wrote in a book called Butterfly, I asked a lot of patients who had thyroid cancer. I interviewed them. I asked my endocrinologist a few questions, and I try to avoid Dr. Google because I don't want to put anything in that's just ridiculous. But I do have a process when I'm telling a story. I sort of always know where I want the story to begin and where I want it to end. But the process in between ebbs and flows because the characters become more real in my brain as I go. Like I went to order something the other day and I was like, Peridot would never order that. So I start thinking about them as if they're living in my head. And so it's been hard to get Peridot out of my head because she was in my brain for a solid year. So now I have to start thinking about Sapphire, and she started, but I don't know her well yet. So
yeah, it's very similar in a way to how actors talk about their acting roles. Sometimes they actually become the character in their real lives to help them experience what the character might experience.
Right. And that's why I think the chronic romance series, which was Butterfly, Dragonfly, and Firefly, each had pieces of me. So Butterfly is about thyroid issues. Dragonfly was about rheumatoid arthritis, which I don't necessarily have rheumatoid arthritis, and I didn't have the thyroid cancer that I wrote about. And the last one was depression. Now, I do have a thyroid disease. I do have an autoimmune arthritis disease, and I do suffer from depression. So little bits of me, little snippets of stories, things that sort of happened to me were in there, or my reaction to things, but it wasn't really me in the story. So I try and use my life experience, but again, I don't want it to be so biased that it's just coming out of me, because I want it to cause a reaction in other people that they can relate to it, and not everything can be about me. So that's been my thing. Like I'm trying to learn how to put different points of view into the story and things like that.
Did you face any challenges when you were writing and publishing, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Well, I sort of got into this in a very unique way. Professionally, I'm a speech language pathologist. I work in schools. I've been doing this. I just started my 33rd year. It was COVID, which is how I actually got my pen name, Georgia James. So COVID hit, and I had just done my very first author visit. I did a big visit with my dog, Georgia Grace. My first book was about her. I did an author visit, and it sounds kind of crazy. She peed at the visit. That was not my dog.
When you say an author visit,
I went to a school with the dog, and I talked about the book, and I talked about the writing.
So you went as a writer.
I went as a writer. And it was in front of like 500 fifth graders, and I brought the dog, and she was a therapy dog, so she was great with kids, but she peed, and that's not my dog. My dog wouldn't do that. And again, she lived well past the time they told me to. She had all the breed diseases. So the book was about living with chronic illness, which is something I knew about. And I worked very hard to give that dog a very good life. My goal in life was to make sure she was happy and to never let her suffer. So that was in March. About 3 weeks later, we shut down. Or that was in February. 3 weeks later, we shut down. And 2 weeks into the pandemic, I was doing online speech therapy, and she was so sick, and she was laying at my feet, and I was trying not to panic. And it was very traumatic because the emergency room wouldn't let me go in with her to hold her as she crossed. And I fought to give her a good life. It was COVID. They weren't allowed to have patients in.
Oh, gee.
So I called my vet, and my vet actually drove in from New Jersey. I live outside of Philly. She drove in from New Jersey. She waited for the place to close. I sat in my car. She came out. She decided it was time, and she let me come in, and she let me hold her. And the vet tech and the doctor who were with me for so much of her life were with me as she crossed over. And it was traumatic. So I lost my dog, Georgia, right at the time where we're all shut down. So it was very painful. Summer goes through. My dad fell, broke his hip. He needed surgery. He ended up in the hospital. He was placed in a rehab hospital, and he contracted COVID, and he died. So that, again, extremely traumatic. traumatic to say your goodbyes via iPad.
Yeah.
It was just extremely traumatic, and taking care of my mom afterwards, it was just traumatic is the best word I can say. You know, I have such bitterness that I couldn't be with him. 22 days after that, well, the day after my dad passed, my uncle had fallen and he had to go
Oh,
to the
gee.
hospital. So
Boy,
22
boy.
days after that, he also died from COVID,
Oh my
this
goodness.
pre-vaccine.
Oh my gosh.
22 days after that was Christmas Eve, and my cousin Patricia, who she was not much older than me, but she lost her battle with cancer, and her death hit me because I was like, she's like my age, like, and she lost her battle with cancer. And I think seeing all that loss and going to her wake and seeing, you know, everybody with masks, it was just, everything was traumatic. And I was home alone a lot because we were not allowed to get together with people. And I was so afraid of spreading it to my mom. I was alone. So to fill my time, I started writing. Not just my blog, which I had always written in my blog. I felt like I just had this pull inside of me that I needed to write. And I wrote a book called Butterfly. And I was like, all right, I don't want to put it out under my name. So I took Georgia, who was my dog, and James, who was my dad, and I became Georgia James. There is another Georgia James, so I eventually added a K in the middle. So now this book is published as Georgia K. James. So that's sort of how everything started. Now with e-publishing, my first book I went through a publisher called Blurb. The books were beautiful. It was mainly a picture book. There was a story through it. It was the dog telling her story of living with all these diseases and having a good life. I chose Blurb because I was doing a lot of pictures, and they had, at the time, that was their thing. Like, if you want to do pictures book, we do great quality. So I did it that way.
Art picture books or photography?
It was
Art
photography. I
drawn?
took all the
Okay.
pictures that I had taken of her, and I created a story with all the pictures of her. So I chose Blur because they did publish on Amazon. And it sold, and I didn't know this. It was when she passed away, I got contacted by people in 26 countries. I had no idea
Wow.
her book went that far because I donated the money. And then some money came back to me because they knew her bills were astronomical. So the organization I donated it to gave some back to me. And so anytime any money comes through from that book, I still pass it on. But it sold around the world. And, you know, I remember my friend in Australia getting it and holding it up and saying she picked it up from a store. So it was really exciting. So writing was never something I thought about. Writing a book was never anything I thought about. But it's become my little passion project, and people seem to like it. So I've been doing it. Why I chose self-publishing, I really don't know how to do it any other way. Like I said, I'm a speech therapist, so I just decided I didn't think many people would read it, but people seem to be liking it. So my goal in the next year is to look at publishers elsewhere.
So it sounds like the reception was really good. Did you have readers reach out to you at all after reading your books, and have they shared their experiences with you?
Yeah. So I have somewhat of a name in the arthritis community where I have a nonprofit and I do a lot of work with other advocates. So a lot of people in that realm reached out to me. A lot of people shared it with their friends. I received a lot of response from the book Dragonfly, which talked about living with rheumatoid arthritis. A lot of people wrote to me and said, hey, you know, thank you, because you know, there's a scene where how I get out of bed in the morning some days, and it's not like you can get up. And I remember, you know, trying to hide that part of myself in relationships. Like, I didn't want people to see that, like, I can't get up in the morning, like I'm stuck. So I wrote about that, and I got a lot of feedback from people who read it and said, oh my gosh, that trying to get up in the morning, she's like, that is something that nobody understands. Like, you'll lay in bed for hours because you have to pee, but you can't get your back to unlock, or you can't stand up. And it's a symptom of rheumatoid arthritis, but people don't often see that in a book. And it's just, you know, it's about representation.
So technically, you haven't worked ever with a publisher or agent or something like that?
No,
Editor?
not yet. I ended up following some really amazing authors, and they were doing it all themselves.
Themselves.
So I have found some literary agents, and I will be submitting. Again, I see myself as a speech therapist. So I don't know. It's beyond my realm of knowledge. I thought I would write these, and I thought, like, my parents would read them. My mom hasn't even read them. She's not reading them, but other people did read them, and I get feedback, and I like if I get like a review that I don't know a person. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's awesome that they liked it, or just giving some honest feedback, because I know I'm not the best writer in the world, but I'm really trying very hard.
Sounds
But I
like you're
have
working hard at it. Yeah.
I have worked with publishers in terms of I've done a lot of writing for health organizations. I've like I said, I've been in some books where I've been sort of given an assignment to write. I've done those kind of things, but as for deadlines and things like that, I'm not there yet, but I'm retiring soon, so I'm hoping that that's something I can do.
There you go. So you're not actively promoting your books? Are you relying on
I
word of mouth? And how was your promotion work for those books?
I do take out some ads. I do some advertising through Amazon. Like I said, my first book was through Blurb, and it did sell very well, but there was a huge chunk of money that went to the publishing, as opposed to
So it's a self-publish,
right,
in the sense of you're paying for the number of run books in a run, and then it
right,
takes from there, and you
right,
promote it yourself. Yeah.
right. So with when I started writing as Georgia K. James, I moved over to Amazon, and Amazon makes it very easy, very, very easy to publish
They
things.
have a tool,
They
yeah,
have a
for
tool, and
formatting, and yeah.
it's really brilliant because it is step by step how to do it. They do have courses on marketing, which I have done. They do have they do take a chunk. I'm not going to lie. They do take a chunk of the savings, but I also do their Kindle Unlimited program, which I get paid per page. So I think because it's a free book, a lot of people will go through and read them that way. So I do get a lot of Kindle Unlimited purchases.
Yes, and for if anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's you get Kindle books. If you have a Prime membership, for example, you get a certain number of points, and then the points accrue to you can purchase a book.
Kindle
and
Unlimited
download it to your
Kindle Unlimited is actually it's one of their separate
offerings.
offerings. I believe it's $12.99 a month, and you get unlimited access.
Unlimited access.
Yeah.
Right. But it's the ebook, not
the ebook.
hand put in your hands book. Yeah.
Correct. So my book is available in both formats.
I'm just curious. I like the book in my hand, although I do both. I am perfectly happy to read anyway I get it. But do you have a preference in your own reading? Or are you just like me? You'll take it any way you can get it?
I wish I could say yes, because I do like books.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, living with arthritis, I can't hold a book
for
hold long periods of time.
I know what you mean.
My hands cramp. I can't hold them like that. My hands swell. So for me, like I said, Kindle was the best gift I ever received.
It is great.
It's so much easier to read, and my hand doesn't fatigue as much. So for me, that's great. Now, the past couple of years, I've really been into Audible. And I did look into publishing an Audible, and it's just so far above what I'm capable of doing financially. And I don't really think at this point, I don't think I have an audience that would pick up the book that way. Although I do think a lot of my neighbor friends are like, oh, I'd love to listen to it. Is it on Audible? And I'm like, that's well above my ability right now. And I've looked into it, and it seems extremely pricey. So at this point, I'm not there. I'm hoping at some point I can do that. But I think that's what I would need more of a publisher for. So, I've copyrighted the books. I'm going to then submit to publishers. It's just figuring out how to do that and manage my everyday life has been a little bit more difficult.
Now there's a lot of challenges and things you brought up about ebooks really hits home with me. My wife was challenged at reading because of vision problems. She couldn't read the small text. So being able to make the text larger allowed her to continue to read, which was something she really enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
So I can really relate to the physical connection with the book sometimes gets lost in the discussion because
Mm-hmm.
if you can't hold it and you can't read it, it makes it very difficult for you to read a book.
Right.
You mentioned that you have written several books and you had planned on some future projects, another ebook maybe. Is that where you're heading?
Yes. Yes. So Peridot is the first in a series of four. So there will be four more stories coming. It's funny, the first series that I did, again, I started mostly during COVID. So those books
Mhm.
sort of came out of me very quickly. I think the three of them were done in a total of 2 years, where Peridot took me a
Wow.
solid year. It took me a solid year. And so I'm figuring a year for each. I will give myself that time. Um, just
How
because
many hours a day do you write?
it depends.
It
I
depends. Yeah.
living with chronic illness, I experienced something called brain fog, and
Yeah.
I've learned how to adapt to it at work. You know, I write things down. I have things on my calendar. I can adapt for things. Um, but sometimes when I come home, especially after working all day, I just can't think. And I've let my blog really fall to the wayside because I've been doing not my virtual stuff. I've been doing my author work. So, yeah, the little thing called work kind of gets in the way of,
It does. I know what you mean. Yeah.
eh.
Yeah.
But
How do
yeah,
you engage with a fiction story in terms of plotting? So I know a lot of people will outline it and then they
mhm,
write to the outline. Some people just go, and
yeah,
then you can get into trouble because you're suddenly, oh, I've got to go back and change all of this in
mhm,
order to get to this point that I've
exactly.
now created.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't write a specific outline. Like I said, I have my
Mhm.
beginning, I have my end. I know where I want
Okay.
it to go. I do have dear friends of mine who are all like English majors, educators, who will read it and give me feedback
Oh,
because,
yeah.
and my one friend actually, she did a lot of the editing on Peridot, and she said to me, you said this in chapter 2. So this doesn't make
Yeah.
sense in chapter 7. I'm like, thank you. Because
Yeah.
I will go back and read it. But what I find is I know the story so well at that point that I
You don't
miss.
see that error.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
So getting feedback. And this time I actually had 5 people give me feedback. Like I didn't ask, I asked people to look for grammar and punctuation. I asked for people to give me their insight on the story and to give me, you are an avid book reader. Like, is this okay? To give me your feedback. And they were all really honest. And I went back and I took
That's
all
great.
the notes that they gave me and I went back and I fixed things. And I changed things along the way. And then I always give, I'm a little tricky. I always give them an ending, but 90% of the time I have changed the ending
Oh boy.
so that when they get the book, they'll see, oh, that's not what I read. So they will get a final copy that isn't exactly what they read. But getting feedback along the way and making sure, and, I always say I have ADHD. I don't always, I just go. So I do just go with writing. What I've tried to do this time is really focus on building more of a story outside of the main storyline, like engaging with other people, like other sites, providing really descriptive language. That sort of what I tell my students often when, that have expressive language disabilities. I often say you need to paint a picture in my brain of what you're telling me. I don't know anything about lacrosse. So you have to paint a picture in my brain because I don't know anything
Oh,
about it.
yeah.
So in my writing process, I really try and paint a picture in other people's brains. And I think I gravitate to authors who really do that. So I'm an avid reader and I listen a lot on Audible. So I'm always listening to books. I probably go through 2 or 3 books a week and I listen to a lot over and over again because little
Mhm.
bits of their stories kind of inspire me, like, oh, I love how they did that. How can I do something similar? So it's not copying, but it's like oh wow, they were able to expand on something like that. Like, how can I do that for Peridot, or how can I do that for Sapphire?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you kind of got to the question I was going to ask you next. What advice would you give authors who want to e-publish? Would you say reading lots of authors to help you come up with storylines, maybe the first step in the ebook publishing process?
Yeah, and I get a lot more questions about publishing from people who want to write more like anthologies that are including stories from other people. So I have a dear friend who wrote a book about people living with rare diseases. And she put out an all call to many patient communities to say, hey, if you have a disease that is rare, please send me a story. And so we talked a lot about the publishing, and I think the hardest thing is making sure the formatting is correct, the going through all the final details. It is a very tedious process. I would say the last 2 weeks of editing was me sitting on my computer until 5 o'clock in the morning, just going through everything, combing through everything. And it is extremely tedious to get it out if you're doing it yourself, but you also don't want it going out with a gazillion errors. So,
oh gosh, yeah.
and I had released something that had errors and I felt terrible. So now it's fixed, but sometimes even though I had 5 people look at things, people still miss stuff. So it happens. I think it happens too. I've read ebooks where I'm like, oh, that's missing something. So I think it happens. Because in addition to those things, I also run it through like Grammarly. I run it through Microsoft to find any misspellings or any errors, and they didn't come up with them either. So
yeah. Well, sometimes it's contextual, and
exactly.
there's, it can't see that because it's just artificial intelligence, and it's very frustrating.
Yeah.
But if I have a complaint about the e-publishing as an option, it's that you don't have a relationship with an editor / agent, someone who will keep you honest and, say, go back and redo that because I'm missing something in here and you need to, and it's really hard to do it yourself.
That's why
you just don't see your own, because
that's why I have a
you know where it's
people.
going.
Yeah.
That's great. That's
and
wonderful.
The people that I asked, I think would be extremely honest with me. So
that's very important.
So
yes.
2 people I asked just because they're big book lovers. So I wanted their opinion on the books. Like, is it flowing? Does it make sense? Are the connections between chapters, are they okay? Am I, if I'm speaking in this character's voice, is it different from this character's voice? So I asked them what to tell, like I tell them, like, tell me what you think, be honest. And then I had like I said, I had other people who did more of the meat and potatoes of the story, where they were looking at the grammar, the correct spelling, the punctuation, if I had things written one way, if I capitalized something here and I didn't capitalize something here, like, so I had somebody doing that. And then I had one last person who just sort of said, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like, I'm not sure where you're going with this. So I asked brutally honest people to give me feedback. And it helps. And, in a perfect world, I do thank them in the book. In a perfect world, I would be able to pay them what they deserve for that, but I give them a little something. But yeah, it's doing it by myself was definitely, I needed feedback.
I wonder if there's any kind of clearinghouse, and I've never even thought of this, but for people who would be willing to offer themselves as a beta reader, not compensated, but just because they want to get involved in the process.
Well, there is a social media thing. I'm in several authors' fan groups, so to say. There was an author I found in 2012, and she's probably, I'm not a big fangirl. Like, I wouldn't be like walk up to somebody and be like, oh my gosh, I'm your biggest fan. Like, I'm not that kind of person, but I actually drove to Maryland to go to her book signing. It was at Nora Roberts, who's a very famous author. It was at her bookstore.
Oh my.
And I went and I said to Kristen, her name is Kristen Ashley, and I said, I have to tell you, I've never fangirled before, but I am totally fangirling over you. Her book sort of changed my life in a way. She created characters that I wish I could be friends with. And that's sort of my goal with this next series of books is I want to, I love when books connect with each other. So my last book in the chronic romance series had a character
Mm-hmm.
in it who was from the South, was very outgoing, very bubbly. She met this woman from Philadelphia and became entwined with them. And she was, she had a decent amount of time in Firefly. So when I was thinking about doing another series, the thing that Kristen Ashley always does is she'll pick a character you might not quite expect, and she'll base a story on that. So I took Opie, who was from this city in Alabama, and it's a spin-off. They're her nieces. So she's going to be a connector that people are like, oh, there's Opie. Like, I remember Opie. And so in researching that, I did a lot of reading about Alabama. I did a lot of reading about Alabama, because I was describing homes, like what the homes are like in Alabama, the climate, the temperature for certain times of the year. Like, I went through and tried to make sure I was being as accurate as possible because I don't live in Alabama. But that's where I felt I just had a calling that's where they're from. She's from Alabama. So,
Is there anything in your ebook publishing experience that you might have done differently now that you've been through the process?
Yeah, I'm sure there are other ways. Like, I've been contacted by publishers about my blog. It was me paying for an editor to come in and go through all of my blog posts and turn that into a book. And I opted not to do that because my blog is more of a diary of things, as opposed to being like, I'm very good friends with a lot of bloggers, and they are more call to awareness action bloggers, where mine is more personal stories. Like, I will take something that's in the news and I'll relate it to my life, and then I'll put that out there. So when the editors were talking to me about that, they were like, well, we could turn that in. And I was like, you know what, that even though I do put it out there for public consumption, I don't think it wouldn't hold a lot of value as a book other than me going, oh, look, I wrote a book. I didn't think it would hold value. But I have talked to Macmillan Publishing has, like, they have a service very similar to Amazon, but I think it's more people based. But there's another one. So I went through Amazon before I knew about Macmillan, and when I looked at both, Amazon just gets you the biggest exposure. So that's sort of why I went with them. I don't know if that's the smartest thing to do, but I know in order to get people, like you said, are there people who read things? There are authors who have these groups where they have arcs, and they will send out a copy to certain people who write blogs and book reviews, and then those people will then start promoting. And that's what I have to move into next. So my books are on Goodreads, but I have to set up an author page, and to do that I need a website. So, I already maintain a website, so now I have to figure out, I have to go and set up another website. So it's just a lot of extra steps, and it's a lot of extra work to do. So finding the time to do it. But my next goal in the next 6 months is to have a website, to have an author page on Goodreads, and to start really marketing through those things, because it needs to be more than word of mouth. So reaching out to those book reviewers. And I am going to an event called Indies Invade Philadelphia, which is all independent authors who, many of who I've read, many of whom I've never heard of. But my goal is in the next couple of years to maybe be a part of that event as an actual author. That's my goal moving forward. So I'm trying to set these goals and see if I can reach them. So far I've reached some, but there's a lot more to do.
Well, I think completing a book is a challenge. Many writers would be happy to just score.
Right.
That's they start and then don't get over the finish line. So good on you for that one.
Well, and it's funny. I remember an author saying this, that every time she says she writes a book, people say, oh, I've always wanted to write a book. And I can't tell you how often that gets said to me. And I'm like,
oh, sure.
Well, you should do it. But it's honestly, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done.
Starting is easy. Finishing
starting is easy.
Another story, right?
Yeah, it really, it's a lot. It really is a lot of work. I'm just lucky that I think I've had these stories in my head for so long that I was like, oh, this would be a good book. So I think I started writing because I wanted to write a book that I would read. And so that's what I did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems
Mm-hmm.
like you moved from a period of isolation during the pandemic to really
Yeah.
networking to get more fertile information and grounds to write more books.
Yeah, it's definitely evolved into something I never thought I would do. If you would have asked me 10 years ago if I would consider myself a writer, I'd say no. And still to this day, when people say, "Oh, you're a writer," I don't feel like a writer. I still feel like a speech language pathologist, but yeah, I see this as moving in my future, and I would like to keep pursuing it. You know, hopefully at some point it will get more. I'll get more readers. But right now, they're doing better than I ever expected. So I'm happy. I'm sure there's more I can do for marketing. It's just everything takes time and
Oh yeah,
finances, and it's a
and
lot.
learning how to do it. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Just curious, who are some of your favorite writers?
Well, there's always that classic. Harper Lee is just, her book was just so genius, and
Oh yeah.
Margaret Atwood, and like they were just classic writers. My job and living with chronic illness takes so much energy out of me. I used to joke and say I am fine with reading junk because I just can't think
It's
when I get
you
home.
can kick back.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
I know
So
the feeling. Yes.
I love a good romance book. I love a good mystery book. But like I said, Kindle opened up an amazing world of writers to me. Kristen Ashley is probably, she's the one I fangirl over. She's so prolific, and her books are so detailed, and she definitely follows a pattern. She definitely has a formula, which I've learned a lot from. She's so amazing with details, and she's so amazing. Her books are very long and they're detailed, and she connects people from one book to another. And again, she has created characters that I would want to spend time with, that I wish were
Mm-hmm.
my friends. Another writer that I love very much, and I talk to her through social media because I'm in one of her groups, is Kylie Scott. Her books, I think my style is probably closest to hers in many ways. She again creates characters that I'd want to spend time with.
Mm-hmm.
She does stories that are simple and you can relate to them, and they make you want to keep turning the page to find out what happens. Nora Roberts was a big influence in the
Yeah.
past. I'm drawing a blank on certain names. Again, that's the brain fog that I
I
live
know
with.
what you mean. Yeah.
Um,
So
Wally
I know I
Lamb.
can think of the
Yeah.
book, but yeah.
Wally
Right. Right.
Lamb, I think She's Come
Mm-hmm.
Undone is just a brilliant, brilliant book. And when I think about books like that, that is so not the style that I'm able to write at this point. But I think if I keep practicing, I can maybe develop a story like that. But I am just, whenever I read a book, like I just read, I didn't just read it, it was a while ago, Verity by Colleen Hoover. That book, even at the end, I'm still like, what the heck did I just read? It was chilling, it was creepy, it was interesting. And as I'm listening to it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I take inspiration from people like that. Um and I do a book challenge every year, and I'm the worst one. I'm the one who runs the group, and I never meet the challenge because I always, like the last couple of years, I've been writing my own stuff. But I did read a few different books, and I'm trying to push myself to listen to genres that I'm not always as comfortable with, just to sort of challenge myself to learn more about the writing process. And I
Mm-hmm.
have taken courses. I write all day long, but I write more technical stuff professionally. So moving into fiction was really very interesting for me. So character development is something I really worked on in Peridot. And it was funny, all the feedback I got from my ARC readers was, I really liked your character development. And I was like, oh, that's what I was doing, because I didn't mention that to anybody. So I was thrilled. So just
That's
setting
great.
goals, and really, I've learned very quickly, not everybody can write a book. It's
Yeah.
a challenge, and it's frustration, and it's a lot of dedication. And then the
Mm-hmm.
publishing piece is, honestly, I found that to be more easy in terms of getting it out there, because you can put it out there, but the quality is what's the important piece, like putting out something that people might enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my goal.
Can you tease for us, for our listeners, anything that might be coming up on your schedule for books coming up?
Sure. So Peridot was just released this August, which Peridot is a gemstone. So it's actually the gemstone for the month of August. This is a Southern family. Their last name is Sterling, and the mom's name is Opal, and she named all of her kids after gemstones. So there's 5 kids, 1 son. He's not going to have a book, but at this point, I can see all of their stories in my head. So right now we did Peridot, who is the only one who leaves the nest and sort of moves away. So her story is set here in Philadelphia. But now we're moving back to Magnolia Grove, yes, Alabama, which is a made up town. And we're going to learn about Sapphire, and she's a wedding planner, and past love is going to come into her life, and she is going to reconnect, and there's going to be a lot of mystery as to things that separated them, and mystery into, I'm still not sure what her mystery is going to be. I know what I want it to be, but I don't want it to impact anybody's wedding, because I hate when it would impact a wedding. So it's going to be a mystery that's going to be something to do with her business. And so the story is slowly unfurling. I'm getting scenes. And as for my other writing, I'm still doing As My Joints Turn. I'm still blogging for the AI Arthritis, which is my nonprofit that I co-founded. Oh goodness, I think we're on our 10th or 11th or maybe even 13th year. I'm not even sure. Time sort of flies. So I'm still writing for them. I blog for them much more than I do for As My Joints Turn. And I'll be starting Sapphire soon. So hopefully by next September, we'll have Sapphire.
Well, I think this has been a very enlightening conversation.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a very exciting to hear the process from your perspective.
Well, thank
we
you.
look forward to seeing the next series of books. I'm
Absolutely
hooked, and I never thought I'd say this, but this particular genre of books. My mother-in-law was a big fan of romance novels, so I can relate.
It's the best summer reading there is.
And you know what? I moved to Philadelphia in my early 20s, and I spent time going down the shore. That's what we call it. It's not going to the
down
beach.
The shore.
Going down the shore.
Down the shore. Yep.
And a beach read. And you know what? My favorite book, it just popped into my head because I would read it every year on the beach. My favorite book of all time is Leon Uris's Trinity.
Oh, yeah.
I love that book. I think half of my friends have sons named Connor because of that book. It's a fantastic book, and it's epic, and it's filled with love and history, and like that to me is the perfection of a book.
Oh yeah.
So, but yeah, so going down the shore, beach reads, that was a big thing. So a beach read book, that's what I'm hoping I'm putting out. Maybe someday I can write an epic book, but I'm not sure. But I definitely want to put quality books. It might not always be, people will often say, oh, I don't read romance. But then they'll read my book and be like, oh, it was really good. And I'm like, well, thank you.
Yeah. I never thought I'd be a fan of this genre, but it really grabs you, and you want to keep reading more to see what happens and where the story takes you.
Yes.
And those are the best stories. We got to find out what happens.
That's it. I'm going to put your links to your books on Amazon in the show notes for our listeners to find. I want to thank you, Kelly, for taking time out of your busy day to give us your insight into the process. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing what's next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, don't forget, you can catch upcoming episodes on your favorite podcasting service. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And you can always connect with us on Instagram and Facebook, and watch videos of the podcast on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.